The grand marble halls of the Supreme Court fell silent as Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat perfectly still, her dark robe a stark contrast against the polished wood of the bench. Her face remained impassive, but those who watched closely could see a storm brewing behind her eyes. Just moments earlier, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had stepped up to the podium, microphone in hand, and launched a blistering attack that echoed through the chamber. "The Supreme Court has become nothing but a political arm of the conservative movement," Crockett declared, her voice rising with each word. "And Justice Barrett is the perfect example, a religious ideologue appointed by a president who lost the popular vote, pushing her faith onto the American people through her judicial decisions." The audience gasped. Some Democrats in attendance nodded approvingly. Republicans shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The other justices glanced sideways at Barrett, wondering how she would respond to this extraordinary breach of decorum. Congresswoman Crockett, a rising star in progressive circles, stood confidently, having built her reputation as someone unafraid to speak truth to power, especially conservative power. Justice Barrett slowly reached for her microphone. Her hand never trembled, her eyes locked directly on Crockett's. The Congresswoman, with her law degree from the University of Houston and her growing social media following, clearly expected to overwhelm the justice with her accusations. But Barrett, a former Notre Dame law professor and mother of 7 who had faced the nation's toughest confirmation hearings, wasn't about to be intimidated. The tension in the room was electric. Crockett's supporters leaned forward, phones raised, ready to capture a viral moment. Barrett's defenders held their breath, praying she would stand her ground. This wasn't just another dry legal argument. This was a clash between two powerful women representing fundamentally different visions of America. What happened next would send shockwaves through the political landscape and leave millions of Americans stunned by Justice Barrett's response. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more breaking political coverage you won't see anywhere else. The magnificent Supreme Court chamber, with its 44-foot ceiling and iconic red curtains, had seen countless historic moments since 1935. But today's face-off between Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett felt different, more personal, more charged with the raw emotions dividing America. Justice Barrett sat composed at the bench, her brown hair pulled back in her signature neat bun. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had risen from a modest upbringing in New Orleans to become the youngest member of the nation's highest court. A devout Catholic, constitutional originalist, and former clerk to Justice Antonin Scalia, Barrett had been appointed by President Trump in 2020, amid fierce opposition from the left. Despite the attacks on her faith and family during those hearings, she had answered questions with remarkable poise, impressing even some critics with her legal knowledge. Today was supposed to be a routine congressional oversight hearing, where members of Congress questioned the justices about court operations and budget matters. These hearings rarely made headlines until Congresswoman Crockett decided to transform it into something else entirely. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 42, stood at the podium, dressed in a vibrant blue suit that matched the boldness of her words. The Texas Democrat had risen meteorically in progressive circles since her election to Congress. A former civil rights attorney and state representative, Crockett had built her brand on being unapologetically outspoken. With nearly 1 million followers across social media platforms, she had mastered the art of creating moments that would go viral and energize her base. "Let me be clear about something," Crockett continued, her voice echoing through the chamber. "When Justice Barrett was nominated, many of us warned that she would use her position to impose her religious beliefs on all Americans. We were told we were being hysterical. We were told to judge her by her qualifications, not her faith. Well, look at her voting record now." Crockett held up a folder dramatically. "I have here a comprehensive analysis of Justice Barrett's decisions since joining the court. In cases involving reproductive rights, LGBTQ issues, and religious freedoms, she has voted with the conservative bloc 100% of the time. 100%. This isn't coincidence. This is agenda. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't merely about two powerful women clashing. It represented the deepening divide in America between those who viewed the court as a defender of progressive values and those who saw it as the last bulwark against constitutional erosion. Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this hearing had taken. Justice Sotomayor glanced sympathetically at Barrett, despite their ideological differences. Justice Thomas removed his glasses, his face betraying rare emotion. For Barrett, this moment transcended politics. It struck at the core of her identity, her integrity as a jurist, her faith as a Catholic, and her duty to the Constitution. For Crockett, it was a chance to speak for millions of Americans who feared the court's rightward shift and to cement her status as a progressive champion, unafraid to challenge power directly. The room fell silent as everyone watched Justice Barrett. Would she maintain the traditional judicial restraint expected of Supreme Court justices? Or would she break precedent and respond directly to this extraordinary attack? No matter Barrett's microphone light blinked on, she adjusted it slightly, her wedding ring catching the light, a small reminder of the family and faith that grounded her away from the court. Her eyes remained fixed on Congresswoman Crockett as she prepared to respond to accusations that struck at her very integrity. Justice Barrett, Crockett pressed on, her voice growing more confident with each word. I'm concerned about the appearance of impropriety. Your husband is a private attorney whose clients have interests that sometimes come before this court. Yet you've refused to recuse yourself in several cases where his firm has filed amicus briefs. How can the American people trust your impartiality? The accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Several Republican members of the committee shifted uncomfortably, while Democrats leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. The crowd behind Crockett buzzed with excitement. This was precisely the confrontation they had hoped for. Barrett's expression remained unchanged, but those who knew her well could see the slight tightening around her eyes, the only visible sign that the Congresswoman's words had landed. Furthermore, Crockett continued, building momentum, you gave speeches to conservative legal groups, like the Federalist Society, before your appointment. Groups that had a clear agenda for the court. Groups that celebrated your confirmation as a victory for their cause. She paused dramatically. Doesn't that suggest you came to this position with a predetermined agenda rather than an open mind? Justice Thomas exchanged glances with Justice Alito. This had gone beyond the normal boundaries of congressional oversight into territory that threatened the court's independence. Chief Justice Roberts reached for his microphone, seemingly ready to intervene. But Barrett raised her hand slightly, a signal that she would handle this herself. Congressman Jim Jordan from Ohio suddenly stood up. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. This line of questioning is inappropriate and disrespectful to a sitting Supreme Court justice. The committee chairman banged his gavel. The gentlewoman from Texas has the floor. Crockett smiled, clearly pleased at the disruption she had caused. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the American people deserve answers, not procedural objections. She turned back to Barrett, her expression hardening. Justice Barrett, you wrote in a 2017 Law Review article that judges should not twist the law to match their preferred outcomes. Yet, since joining the court, you voted to overturn long-established precedents. Isn't that exactly the kind of judicial activism you once criticized? The temperature in the room seemed to rise with each accusation. News cameras zoomed in on Barrett's face, hoping to capture any flicker of emotion that might make for compelling television. Crockett wasn't finished. She held up her phone, displaying a social media post. This morning, I asked my followers what they would want me to ask you. Over 50,000 people responded in just 2 hours. The overwhelming concern was about your faith and how it influences your decisions. The separation of church and state seems increasingly blurry with you on the bench. This crossed a line. Several committee members audibly gasped. Questioning a justice's faith so directly violated an unwritten rule in these proceedings, the chairman intervened. Congresswoman, I remind you that Article 6 of the Constitution explicitly states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Crockett nodded, seemingly chastened, but her eyes remained defiant. I'm not applying a religious test, Mr. Chairman. I'm asking about conflicts between personal beliefs and constitutional duty. It's a fair question. She turned back to Barrett, whose face remained a careful mask of judicial composure. Justice Barrett, you've been called the handmaid on the court by critics concerned about your membership in People of Praise, a religious group where women were literally called handmaids until recently. You've never publicly addressed these concerns. Don't you think transparency about such affiliations matters for someone in your position? The room erupted. Republican members shouted objections. Democratic members tried to restore order. Journalists frantically typed on their phones, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would dominate the news cycle. Through it all, Justice Barrett sat unmoved, her gaze steady on Congresswoman Crockett. The attacks had escalated from questioning her judicial philosophy to attacking her faith directly, crossing lines that even Barrett's ideological opponents on the court would consider inappropriate. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! We will have order in this committee!" As the room gradually quieted, all eyes returned to Justice Barrett. The traditional approach would be a measured, minimal response, perhaps even a refusal to engage with such politically charged accusations. That's what everyone expected. But something in Barrett's expression had changed. There was a new resolve in her eyes that suggested she would not let these attacks stand unanswered. She leaned slightly toward her microphone, and the entire room held its breath. Justice Barrett adjusted her microphone with deliberate care. The room fell into such profound silence that the gentle click of the audio system seemed to echo off the marble walls. She looked directly at Congresswoman Crockett, her gaze unwavering, yet curiously without hostility. "Congresswoman Crockett," Barrett began, her voice clear and measured, "I appreciate your passionate advocacy. Truly I do. Robust debate is essential to our democracy." She paused, letting those words settle. "However, I feel compelled to address several factual inaccuracies in your statements." Barrett folded her hands in front of her, a gesture that projected both calm and readiness. "You suggested that I vote with the conservative bloc 100% of the time on certain issues. That's demonstrably incorrect." She reached for a folder beside her, one that hadn't been there when the hearing began. The movement caught everyone by surprise. Barrett wasn't known for bringing props to hearings. "I've taken the liberty of compiling my voting records since joining the court," she continued, opening the folder. "In the past term alone, I joined opinions written by Justice Kagan in 4 cases, Justice Sotomayor in 3, and authored a majority opinion in Reynolds v. United States that was joined by every justice except 1. She looked up. "The court's decisions are far more complex and nuanced than the political binary you describe." Crockett shifted uncomfortably at the podium, clearly unprepared for this direct, factual rebuttal. Barrett wasn't finished. "You mentioned my husband's legal practices creating conflicts of interest. For clarity, Jesse Barrett primarily handles commercial litigation at a small firm in Indiana that has never had a case before the Supreme Court during my tenure. The amicus briefs you referenced were filed by completely unrelated organizations." She turned a page in her folder. "As for my speeches to the Federalist Society, yes, I gave them, just as Justice Sotomayor has spoken to the American Constitution Society, and Justice Kagan to numerous law schools with predominantly progressive faculty. Engaging with legal thinkers across the spectrum is part of our professional responsibility as jurists." The chamber remained silent. Republicans looked stunned, but pleased. Democrats appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Crockett's expression had shifted from confidence to concern. "Regarding precedent," Barrett continued, her tone still even, "I believe you're referring to Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. I would respectfully suggest reading my concurrence in that case, where I specifically addressed stare decisis considerations over 14 pages. You may disagree with my reasoning, but characterizing it as twisting the law misrepresents the careful jurisprudential analysis involved." Barrett closed her folder and looked directly at Crockett. "Finally, Congresswoman, you raised concerns about my faith." The room tensed again. This was the most sensitive territory, the area where Barrett had been expected to either deflect or decline to respond. "When I sat in this building during my confirmation hearings, I was repeatedly asked whether my faith would influence my decisions. Barrett said, her voice taking on a new depth of conviction. I answer then as I answer now. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States. I take that oath seriously. She leaned forward slightly. But I will add something today that I didn't say then. The suggestion that people of faith, any faith, cannot serve this nation with integrity and impartiality is contrary to our finest traditions. John Adams wrote that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. James Madison spoke of the sacred right of conscience. And Justice William Brennan, a Catholic and renowned progressive jurist, wrote eloquently about how the Constitution protects religious liberty precisely because faith has been so central to Americans' identity and moral development. Barrett's voice remained calm, but carried an unmistakable moral authority. The founders didn't establish a religious test for office because they understood that a person's faith, or lack thereof, does not determine their capacity for fairness, integrity, or commitment to the rule of law. She glanced around the room, now addressing not just Crockett, but everyone present. I have 7 children, Congresswoman. 2 adopted from Haiti after a devastating earthquake. Our youngest has special needs. My husband and I have built our life around service to our family, our community, and now to our nation. My faith informs that commitment to service. Yes, it teaches me about human dignity, justice, and mercy, values I believe most Americans share, regardless of their religious beliefs. Barrett paused, letting her words resonate. But when I put on this robe, I am bound by oath to set aside personal preferences and follow the law. The cases before this court involve complex legal questions, not religious ones. Analyze the Constitution's statutes and precedents, not scripture, when forming my opinions. She reached again for her folder and withdrew a sheet of paper. Since you mentioned social media, Congresswoman, I think it's worth noting this tweet from February 2019, before my nomination to the Supreme Court, where you wrote, "Religious discrimination has no place in America. Attacking someone's faith to question their qualifications for office is unconstitutional and wrong." The room erupted in murmurs. Crockett's face registered shock. She genuinely hadn't expected Barrett to be aware of her past statements, let alone bring them to a hearing. I agree with that sentiment completely, Barrett said, her voice cutting through the noise. And I believe the American people, regardless of their political affiliation, do too. As the murmuring subsided, Barrett delivered her final point. The court's legitimacy doesn't rest on whether people agree with every decision we make. It rests on the public's confidence that we are applying the law faithfully, based on text, history, and precedent, not personal preference or political pressure. When public figures suggest otherwise without evidence, they don't just attack individual justices, they undermine the rule of law itself. She straightened in her chair, her expression not triumphant but resolute. I welcome oversight, Congresswoman. I welcome criticism of my legal reasoning. But insinuations about my integrity, based on my faith, or unfounded claims about conflicts of interest, don't serve the American people or our constitutional system. The silence that followed was absolute. Congresswoman Crockett stood frozen at the podium, her prepared follow-up questions suddenly irrelevant. The chairman, seemingly at a loss for words, checked his watch. I believe the gentlewoman's time has expired, he finally said. Crockett nodded, gathered her papers with trembling hands, and returned to her seat without the customary, I yield back. The confidence that had radiated from her at the beginning of her questioning had evaporated. As the next committee member was recognized, phones throughout the room lit up with notifications. Video clips of Barrett's response were already spreading across social media platforms, with comments flooding in by the thousands. Justice Barrett had done something extraordinary. Without raising her voice or showing anger, she had systematically dismantled each accusation while defending not just herself, but core constitutional principles. She had refused to be a passive target and instead turned what was meant to be her public embarrassment into a powerful civics lesson about the role of the court and the importance of religious liberty. The hearing continued, but everyone present knew They had just witnessed a pivotal moment in the ongoing national conversation about faith, law, and the Supreme Court's place in American life. Within 30 minutes of Justice Barrett's response, Barrett's response was trending nationwide. Video clips spread like wildfire across social platforms, most highlighting the moment when she quoted Crockett's own tweet about religious discrimination back to her. Conservative accounts celebrated what they called a masterclass in grace under fire, while even liberal legal commentators acknowledged the effectiveness of Barrett's measured rebuttal. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin appeared visibly uncomfortable during a live broadcast. Whatever your politics, what we just witnessed was remarkable. Justice Barrett didn't just defend herself, she offered a nuanced defense of religious pluralism in public life that will be studied in law schools for years. MSNBC's coverage took a different angle, with one host suggesting, Barrett's performance was polished but carefully scripted. The question remains whether her judicial philosophy truly separates her faith from her legal reasoning. This framing, however, was quickly challenged by a progressive legal scholar on the same panel, who noted, the idea that people of faith can't separate their religious beliefs from their professional duties is precisely the kind of prejudice Barrett just eloquently refuted. At Fox News, coverage was triumphant. Justice Barrett just showed the country why she belongs on our highest court, declared one commentator. Congresswoman Crockett came armed with accusations. Justice Barrett came armed with facts. Meanwhile, at the Capitol, Crockett hurried through hallways crowded with reporters shouting questions. Her staff formed a protective barrier around her as they made their way to her office. Inside, according to sources who later spoke to Politico, an emergency meeting was called to manage the fallout. This is a disaster, one senior aide reportedly said. Social media is brutal right now. We need to reframe this immediately. Crockett's communications director drafted a statement that took a defiant tone. I asked tough questions that needed asking. Justice Barrett's eloquence doesn't change the court's rightward shift, but Crockett herself, according to 3 people present, knew the damage was done. She ultimately approved a more conciliatory statement. I appreciate Justice Barrett's thorough response to my concerns. While we may disagree on judicial philosophy, I respect her service to the court. The statement did little to stem the tide. By evening, prominent Democrats were distancing themselves from Crockett's approach. Senate Majority Leader Schumer told reporters, questions about judicial philosophy are appropriate. Questions that appear to target religious faith cross a line we should respect. House Minority Leader Jeffries was more direct. The Constitution explicitly prohibits religious tests for public office. That principle protects all Americans, regardless of faith tradition. At the White House, Press Secretary Kim Richards faced a barrage of questions about whether the president supported Crockett's line of questioning. The president believes in robust oversight of all branches of government, she said carefully. He also believes deeply in religious liberty and the constitutional prohibition against religious tests for office. On campus at Notre Dame Law School, where Barrett had taught for 15 years before her appointment to the federal bench, students gathered in the Commons to watch replays of the exchange. Professor Richard Garnett, an expert in religious freedom law, told the student newspaper, what Justice Barrett demonstrated today wasn't just legal acumen, but moral courage. She defended not only herself, but a constitutional principle that protects everyone regardless of their faith or lack thereof. Conservative legal organizations quickly capitalized on the moment. The Judicial Crisis Network launched an ad campaign featuring clips from Barrett's response, alongside the message, principles, integrity, Justice Barrett. The Federalist Society announced that Barrett's defense of religious pluralism in public service would be the theme of their annual conference. Progressive groups faced a more complex challenge. Many had legitimate concerns about the court's rightward shift, but recognized that attacks on a justice's faith were counterproductive. The American Constitution Society released a statement calling for substantive critique of judicial decisions rather than speculation about personal motivation. By the following morning, the political landscape had shifted. Conservative women's groups reported record-breaking fundraising hauls overnight. Several organizations announced plans for faith in public service seminars at law schools across the country. Republican strategists described the Barrett-Crockett exchange as a gift heading into the election season, a clear example of progressive overreach on religious issues. For Barrett herself, the day after brought no public comment. She returned to the court for oral arguments in a complex patent case, displaying the same careful attention and sharp questioning that characterized her judicial approach. If the previous day's confrontation weighed on her mind, she gave no indication. Inside the court, however, the impact was significant. Sources close to the justices told the Washington Post that even Barrett's ideological opposites on the bench had been troubled by the nature of Crockett's questioning. Justice Sotomayor, despite frequent dissents from Barrett's opinions, reportedly told a clerk that questioning a colleague's integrity based on faith is beyond the pale. Chief Justice Roberts took the unusual step of issuing a statement. The independence of the judiciary rests on the understanding that judges decide cases based on law, not personal preference or political pressure. Public officials who suggest otherwise without evidence undermine a pillar of our constitutional system. As the week progressed, constitutional scholars from across the political spectrum published analyses of the exchange. Yale's Akhil Reed Amar wrote in The Atlantic that Barrett's response artfully wove together historical, legal, and normative arguments for religious pluralism in public life, a principle that progressives, of all people, should cherish. Harvard's Noah Feldman argued in Bloomberg that Barrett's defense wasn't just of herself or Catholics, but of the very idea that Americans of all faiths can faithfully serve the Constitution. For Congresswoman Crockett, the political consequences mounted. 3 moderate Democrats in competitive districts publicly criticized her approach. Fundraising emails from her progressive supporters attempted to rally the base with subject lines like "standing strong against right-wing attacks." But internal numbers showed lower than expected returns. More damaging was the revelation by the Washington Post that Crockett's staff had prepared a more substantive line of questioning focused on Barrett's judicial decisions, but Crockett had opted for the more provocative approach, targeting Barrett's faith. A former staffer, speaking anonymously, described a strategic decision to generate viral content rather than substantive oversight. 2 weeks later, Crockett appeared on Meet the Press, where she attempted to reframe the narrative. My concern has always been about the court's dramatic rightward shift, not any individual justice's personal beliefs. But when host Chuck Todd played clips of her most pointed questions about Barrett's faith and asked, "Do you regret this approach?" Crockett's hesitation before answering spoke volumes. "I could have phrased some questions differently," she finally conceded. But oversight of the court is vital to our democracy. The most lasting consequence, however, emerged in public opinion polls. A Gallup survey, conducted 3 weeks after the hearing, showed a 7-point increase in public confidence in the Supreme Court, the first significant upward movement in years. Analysis revealed that the increase came primarily from independents and moderate Democrats who had been impressed by Barrett's measured, principled response. Law professors began assigning videos of the exchange in constitutional law classes as a case study in religious liberty and judicial independence. The Congressional Research Service updated its guidance document for members questioning judicial officers, adding a new section on constitutional boundaries regarding religious affiliation. 6 months later, Justice Barrett accepted an invitation to deliver the commencement address at Howard University School of Law, a historically Black institution with a progressive reputation. Her speech, titled "Liberty and Justice for All," never mentioned the confrontation with Crockett, but elaborated on themes from her response: the importance of treating ideological opponents with respect, the danger of reducing complex legal questions to political binaries, and the American tradition of religious pluralism. The Constitution's prohibition against religious tests for office wasn't just about protecting the religious, she told the graduating class. It was about ensuring that our republic would benefit from the talents and contributions of all citizens, regardless of faith tradition. That principle remains as vital today as it was in 1787. Peter, you said earlier, what is the town or city greatly. The speech received a standing ovation. As for Crockett, she faced a primary challenger in her next election, a moderate Democrat who promised to ask tough questions without crossing constitutional lines. Political analysts debated whether the Barrett confrontation would define her career or become a footnote. What no one questioned was that the exchange had become a pivotal moment in the ongoing national conversation about faith, law, and public service. The clash between Justice Barrett and Congresswoman Crockett, begun as an attempt to score political points, had instead sparked a deeper reflection on how Americans of different faiths and political beliefs could engage in meaningful dialogue about the most important issues facing the nation. In Washington's polarized environment, that might have been the most surprising outcome of all. Thank you for watching our in-depth coverage of this historic confrontation between Justice Barrett and Congresswoman Crockett. If you found this analysis valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more exclusive political coverage. Don't forget to share this video with friends and family who might have missed this pivotal moment in American politics. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective on this remarkable exchange.